Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Building with RescriptRelay. In this episode, we'll talk all about pagination and all of the nice little things that Relay does for you, so you don't have to write a bunch of code yourself, and it's a bit safer as well. First, let me talk you through what I'm planning to do here. See, we have our nice little widget down here below that shows the first 4 followers. What I want to do is I want to add another badge here, another avatar style thing, round thing, that says if there are more followers, that tells me how many more followers there are than these 4. And then also lets me click it to reveal another row of followers, essentially. And you remember we have this setup over here where we are asking for the first 4 followers on this field, which returns the follower connection. I'll get back to that in a minute. Then we're asking for the avatar and the ID of these nodes. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up pagination for this field. This is a connection field. Connections is how Relay does pagination, and I'm going to go through a bunch of things about connections now. I would suggest, like, if you have no idea what the connection is, I would pause this video and go to either the RescriptRelay documentation or the Relay documentation itself, or just Google or whatever and search for connections. It's going to be a little bit easier to understand why things are the way they are if you understand a bit about connections first. But anyway, we are going to set up pagination for this fragment. Now remember, pagination, that's done at a fragment basis. And that's pretty neat in Relay. I'm going to show you why. RescriptRelay has a bunch of tooling, as you know. One of these tooling things is that we can mark a field that we know are a connection, and we can call our code action set up pagination on followers for fragment. When I click this, voila! The tooling sets up everything you need in order for this to be a paginated query. So this means that I now have everything configured here to allow me to do pagination. I'm just gonna restore the thing I forgot here. User avatar, right? Cool, perfect. So before you see that things broke here now because it's now another structure. Before we go ahead and fix and continue working on this, I'm gonna go through each of these things just so you get an understanding of what Relay does behind the scenes, and also kind of how everything works here. So the first thing we have here is a refetchable directive, and that takes a query name. Now this is auto-generated for you, the query name, and that's partly because these names need to follow a few certain rules in how they're called. So, but you don't have to worry about that if you're using the RescriptRelay tooling. What this does is that it tells Relay to generate another query that I can use for refetching just this fragment. Remember, we're working with fragments, right? So we're working with components in a potential like tree, potential hierarchy. And the normal way of doing pagination here might be to set up a variable here like we have on followers for first. This, in this case, first means how many items we want to fetch, and after is after which item we want to fetch them. So a classical pagination. The equivalent in regular pagination would be that this is the count and this is the offset, so to speak. But again, remember, this fragment, we don't really know where this is rendered, right? This could be rendered at 4 different places in a query, and it could be deeply nested down with a bunch of other things, and then there could be a bunch of other components. It's likely going to be a bunch of other components as well in the particular query that this is now rendered from, or the queries, like this could be in many queries. So even though like the normal thing you would think to do here is to just reuse the query you already have, but just change the first and after arguments, that's going to be detrimental to performance because you'll refetch everything else in the query as well at the same time. Which you don't really need. Like all you need here in this case is to refetch and fetch more items for this particular fragment, right? Just for followers, just for these things. Nothing else has asked for being refetched or paginated, right? So what Relay does is it generates another query transparently, like you don't, or you're not gonna have to worry about this. But if we search for files here, search followers. Oh, right, I've excluded the generated files. But if we go in here and look in our generated folder, which has all of our artifacts, you can see that we have a artifact here. That's the query itself. And this query will only include this argument and this fragment, and only include the things needed. So that's pretty neat, and Relay will automatically orchestrate using this in the background. So all you have to do in order for all of this to work is just this. You just add the refetchable fragment, and then the compiler, so the refetchable fragment, the refetchable directive, and then the compiler will generate the query for you, and it'll wire everything up behind the scenes for you. So that's what you're actually using. Next up is the argumentDefinitions directive, and we are going to be talking about this and its close sibling arguments later on. And it's going to be, this is something you use quite heavily in Relay, so I'm going to show you a bunch of tricks around this. But essentially, this is variables for fragments, but in Relay's own way. There's a RFC to the general GraphQL spec for including fragment variables. That's not there yet. It's not in the spec yet. Relay has had this forever, essentially. So this is what we're currently using. And what this means is that you can define fragments, you can define arguments to your fragment, and you can say what type they are. And if you want to, you can also give them a default value. So what this means is that we want this fragment to be able to take an argument of first, and if first isn't supplied anything, first will automatically be 5 in this fragment, and then we want it to be able to take an argument of after as well. That's a string. That's our cursor. But it's fine to not supply it. If it wasn't, we could make this required in general, like GraphQL syntax here as well, if we wanted to. Then we can use these arguments, or these variables, just like we would use like in normal variables as well. So we pass first to first, after to after. Remember, this is how many things we want to fetch, and this is after what we want to fetch it. And then we come down to the final directive, and this is the connection directive. This also has a special naming rule here. So, and that's all generated for you as well, so you don't need to worry about that, the key here. This is what tells Relay that, whoa, we want to paginate this in a certain way. And we want the unique key for this particular pagination to be this. And the reason this exists is because many different fragments and components and stuff might paginate on followers, right? So you wouldn't want this pagination, what you fetch here, to automatically be added to other connections or other fragments that hasn't asked specifically to be paginated, right? That would be kind of weird. So if this was treated just like a regular field with no other, nothing unique per fragment that wants to paginate it, you would end up a scenario where I ask for things here, and then things automatically appear in other lists as well if I have them, and that might break things. So this is to make this unique. There's another thing. Relay will then ignore these things as they write into it. It'll write into the store under the cache key of this, and any other variables that you pass in here. Now this field doesn't have any other variables or arguments rather than the classical pagination arguments. But if it were to have something like status, like a follower status or whatever, this would also automatically be included inside of the cache key. So pagination done here would only be valid for this particular fragment and for this particular status that's set whenever that's passed in. There's a way to avoid that by using something called filters. Here, if we pass an empty array to filters, then it'll never include anything else inside of the cache key it's using other than this. So that means that even if I had status here and I called this with 10 different statuses, everything would be merged together in the same kind of pagination. Then you can go ahead here and say that I have two things. I have status and I have whatever. can't come up with something clever, so we'll call it whatever. If I wanted only status to matter for the caching, so status is what I want to matter, I could add that here. And this would ensure that whenever I paginate, it'll discard whatever is, like it won't matter, it'll add it to the same thing, but it'll care about status. So if I first call this with status online, then status offline, there'll be two different types of paginations. So I could go back and forth between them. Whereas if I call it with different whatever values, they end up in the same thing anyway. Okay, we're not going to use this right now, so we'll probably get back to this in a later video where I'll show this more hands-on, because that'll be easier to make it easier to understand. But that's a little bit of background about that. So this is what tells Relay that we're using a connection. So now there's a couple of other things happening behind the scenes as well. I'm going to show you. But first off, connections. What are those? So connections are generally just a structure. So even though this field type is called follower connection, it could have been called just follower or whatever. The name isn't important. It's not a concept in that kind of way. It's a structure. And in that structure, your field needs to have something called page info. This is going to contain a bunch of information about the current pagination. So end cursor, this is the final, like where you would continue to paginate from if you wanted to continue paginating forward. This has next page, tells you whether there's indeed another page to paginate forward, because that's a cool thing about connections. Now you can use them just going forward if you want, but inherently in the structure is that you're supposed to be able to paginate both backwards and forwards. And that's kind of neat, because that means that you can just start somewhere, wherever you want, inside of your pagination items, and just go back and forth kind of as you want to. But most people are going to be using forward pagination. I think I use backwards pagination very rarely. So forward pagination is the one to try and understand as good as possible. So continuing here, it has previous page, which also like indicates whether you can go backwards, and then start cursor is the cursor that you would use to go backwards in order to continue. But good part here is you don't need to care about anything about this. Relay is automatically going to insert that into your refetch query. It's going to handle all these things yourself. So you don't need to care about what the pagination info says. So continuing on, a connection needs to have page info, then it needs to have edges. And edges are the list of things that you are getting back from the pagination. And each edge, it needs to have a cursor, and it needs to have a node. Actually, I think nowadays cursor isn't really required anymore. I think you do well enough with just the page info. But just for the sake of it, you need to have a cursor, let's say that, and then a node. Now the cursor, start with the node. The node is the item itself. So we're paginating followers, which are users, right? So the node is going to be a user. So we can see here, the cursor is the kind of unique identifier that you would use in order to continue paginating from this specific user, either going backwards or forwards. And that's together here in the structure. See here, cool. Now that's all you need to know about the structure, really. But and you might think this, like, why is this so complicated? Why is the structure so what you call it, elaborate, or like so contrived, essentially? Why is this not just returning a list of users? Couldn't that work? It could work, and it'll work in many cases, but connections are designed to handle most, if not all, of the cases you can encounter as you're paginating. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. The first thing is obviously page info. You need some way to communicate from the server whether there's items left to paginate on. Essentially. Okay, so we can't really return a list, but we could return a object that has page info and then return nodes like we have here. That's just a list of just a list of users, right? And this is something the GitHub API adds itself. So that's not something that's part of the connection spec, so to speak. And that could work, that could get you far. And page info is one thing that you need on this object, but here's another custom thing that's also not included in the connection spec, but that's nice. That's total count. GitHub tells you how many followers are there really in this particular connection. And that's neat, and we're going to use that obviously here, starting out. So you can put a bunch of things on the connection directly that's metadata for the connection itself as you're paginating through it. Total count is a good example here. So why can't we just have nodes? We could just have nodes, but for edges, there's a way to include edge-specific or node-specific data here without having to litter the node type itself. So the edge can contain metadata that just revolves around this particular node in this particular pagination, right? So one example here is the cursor, obviously, that you can point out a single thing in this particular collection, and this wouldn't make sense to have on the user, right? Because that's different depending on what connection you're using. A user could be part of a connection that's not just the followers, could be any other connection essentially. So this is specific to the connection itself. But imagine that you were to have a connection that's search results, and you wanted to, for each search result, you wanted to include something like how well this matched the original search term, for instance, or if you have a connection where you're searching for locations, maybe you wanted to, for each location that you search, you want to include the distance from where we're currently at. These are typical things that are nice to put on a metadata object like the edge. That's not really part of the type itself. So it's connection specific data around there. And that's good to remember. So it's not about it's not something that you'll use in every single situation, but it's something that really has, or the connection spec itself makes you prepared for. So when you get to a scenario where you need metadata on the each edge to show something in your search results, or when you need metadata on the connection itself, then you're prepared, and it'll be very easy to put together. That's a lot of talking, right? Way too much talking, way little code. So we're going to transition here to actually write out our review the way we want it. So the first thing we notice here is that we no longer have the nodes properties. We're going to have to take this structure and turn it into a list of nodes, non-nodable nodes. And that looks annoying, right? We have edges, we have node, and this is optional, and this is also probably optional. Yep, it is. Luckily, we realized quite quickly that this is annoying to do. So whenever you have a connection directive inside, RescriptRelay will automatically generate a function for you that's available right on the module that's a fragment, called getConnectionNodes. This one will automatically loop through and turn your connection into an array of non-nullable nodes, just like what you want. So this is quite neat. This saves a lot of headache, not you having to unwrap stuff yourself. Now, obviously, this just works when you want just the nodes. If you were to have metadata on here that matters, you'd have to unwrap that yourself, but that's pretty easy as well. But moving on here, you can see that we're now back, and now we're fetching 5 instead of 4 before, and that's because we put the default value here to 5. If we were to change this to 4, it'll be 4. Back, and this also, this affects the query we're currently in, the main query, so we're not doing anything with the pagination query so far, right? But we still only get the user object here and no way to paginate. And that's because whenever you have pagination, like the standard way to use fragments in Relay, or RescriptRelay rather, is to use the use hook. But when you have a fragment set up with pagination, there's also a bunch of other things. usePagination, for instance. And usePagination is what we want to use here. That'll give you a bunch of different things. So we can get this. See a bunch of different functions. We have the data itself. We'll have loadNext, load previous, hasNext, hasPrevious, is loading next, is loading previous, blah, blah, blah. And we also have the refetch function, which we're going to be talking more about in a later video where we do refetching. But again, notice that this isn't the kind of user anymore. This is instead another structure where, wrong place. Here, where data is the user, right? So if we go ahead here and we pick out data, here are all the other things I was talking about. We'll use a few of them here. Go ahead and pick out data, and for the sake of it, we can alias that to user. Then everything's going to be working again, right? We're back. More things we'll need here is we'll need whether we have a next page or not. We'll need if we're loading the next page, and then we'll need a way to load the next page itself. Cool. So the first thing I want to do here is, like I said, I want to add a small kind of avatar looking thing here that tells me how many followers are left now that we paginated. So in order to do this, we'll need to get the total count, right? We'll need to have that. How many followers are there in total? So we select that. We can say followers left is the user.followers.total count minus and all of the followers we currently have. Perfect. Because all of the followers we've currently fetched, they're all going to be inside of this run, right? So that's neat. We have followers left. We'll go ahead down here and we'll add a div -4 like that. We'll add a string. We'll say followers left. Do a plus there. Okay, let's make this look like the avatar. Border 2, border white. Let's make this, slate background. Sounds good. Text slate 600. See how that looks. Oh, it's not very round, is it? But we have the technology to fix that. Rounded full. Looks slightly better. Gotta flex it. Justify center, item center. And let's make it tiny as well, the text. Ah, that looks better. Cool. So, but I made this a div, and that's pretty stupid, right? I want this to be a button, because we gotta be able to click this later on. Make this a button. Now that we go in here, we can hover. But we need to do a couple of other things here. Now we're always rendering this, even if there were no followers left. So, and we only want to render this and make it clickable whenever there's it's actually possible to paginate, right? So we'll switch on followers left and on has next. So let's say that if there are no followers left, or if there are followers left, but we have no next page according to relay, then we'll render nothing. But if we do have followers left, and we do have a next page, then we'll render our nice little button here. Great. That should work. Now, let's do a on-click here to actually do our pagination. So, when we're clicking this button, we want to load next. And in this case, we'll load 6 because we'll need 1 for the top row and then the rest for the row below to restore this this shape, kind of. So I'm calling load next, but it's complaining. It's complaining that onClick wants you to return nothing, a unit, but this is returning a disposable. So what is a disposable? A disposable is something that you get back from Relay in certain cases, like paginating or refetching and stuff. And it's essentially a control that you get for this particular operation. So with a disposable, you could call either dispose or ignore. Ignore is just a type-safe way of saying that I don't care about this. I'm not going to do anything in particular with this. Treat this as nothing, as unit. Dispose, though, it'll tell Relay to stop doing whatever it is you're doing and don't write anything to the store, essentially. And if you have data that comes from here, like this isn't as, this doesn't matter in this case, but there are cases where you, for instance, get disposals back from queries and stuff. It tells Relay that any data you have associated with this thing here, you can just go ahead and garbage collect that whenever you want. Go ahead and remove it if you want to. So we could call this ignore. This used to be more important in earlier versions of Rescript, but now you can either do this, call this on ignore, or you can do this. So what does this mean? It's a little bit of Rescript magic here. It essentially says that call loadNext, and whatever it returns, pipe it into or put it into underscore, which means don't care about it. Like, right, underscore is just don't care about it. And as you can see, we're already redefining. We're saying the same thing here for the props to onClick, don't care about it. And we're redefining this, and that's neat with Rescript. You can assign to underscore as many times as you want to, essentially. Okay, so this should get us pagination ready, right? So if I click this, yay, we get a new line, and then we get a new line, and then we get a new line. Really nice. If we go into the network though, you know how I am with my loading states. So we do 3G here, click. That's not very nice, it doesn't show you anything, right? So we're going to add a few minor things here related to the loading state. So the first thing I want to do is I want to, whenever, like obviously you shouldn't be able to click this whenever you're loading next. You shouldn't be able to trigger many things at the same time. Now I want this to pulsate whenever it's loading, right? That would be cool. In order to do that, that's really easy, of course. I'm going to use a small utility that I always copy into my projects, u.tv Tailwind, and this is very, very simple. All it does is it takes an array of strings, it trims each part, and then makes sure that it's not, it filters out anything that's an empty string, and then it just joins it back. So this means that you can throw things in here and have it act as conditionals for Tailwind. So in this case, if we're loading next, we're doing animate pulse. Otherwise, we're doing nothing. So go back, do some throttling, press it. Oh, nice. And I can't click it. That's pretty neat. But there's another thing you can do as well. That's my personal favorite for this to be even clearer. And that is, remember that we have a pending indicator bar, right? A component. Pending indicator bar. We can wire that up to is loading next as well. And remember this component. It's just a small kind of component that creates a loading bar and throws it up the top of the screen and then makes a progress out of it that looks like it's tied to the actual operation, but it's not. It's pretty classical in apps, and I love this. I use this whenever I have an action that might take some time. It's so easy to just throw up a pending indicator bar and have it co-located here right next to the code it's at. Since it's a fixed element that's on the top, that's going to work out well for you. So if we see how this looks now with here, press that. Oh, and we get the pending loading indicator up there as well. Nice. Press again, loads, press again, and this shimmers and it loads. And that's pretty nice. So we have pagination all set up, and you can see as well the count obviously changes and stuff. This is all working well. Now I want you to notice a couple of things. First off, we can go, I did a change here in this one, but otherwise notice that we've only edited this file. And this still works if we go into all the other kind of the other view we have. You remember that this is a distinct query, even though the view looks the same. It's a distinct query because this is the user profile, and the other was the dashboard. This works here as well in this one, and this would work anywhere else that you were to render this user followers widget. And that's really neat. Like, even though we've got a separate pagination query, it's making separate requests to your server. See here, for instance, if we check out this payload variables after blah blah queries, it's a pagination query it's making. It's only returning data. It's using the node interface. That's another cool part. It'll generate the query That's actually something we should cover as well. What it'll do when it generates this query is it won't, like, it doesn't know where you're spreading this user, right? It could be like we know that we're spreading it on the viewer in the dashboard query sense, right? But this could be anywhere. So what it'll do, it'll generate a query that's on the node interface, see, it's on the node interface. And that'll make it possible to refetch just this single user and just the things you want from this single user. Okay, so and the final thing I want to show here is that when we navigate back and forth, see that it remembers the connections. So it remembers what you had. So there's no, like, you don't ever need to, like, redo the pagination or the connection itself as you're navigating back and forth. Yeah, so again, like, remember, you're only editing this particular thing, and in this case you're adding nothing extra to the original query because of the pagination, other than the setup here. Relay will take care of everything for you. Also notice that even though we have first and after, we don't really need to... Oh, I'm blanking here. What am I calling this? The query, a user profile, of course. Or let's say dashboard. Yeah, cool. Also notice that we're spreading this here, we're rendering it, but we're not actually needing to change anything here. Like, this query, this component doesn't know anything that this is going to paginate or how it's going to paginate. All it knows is that render me on a user, and the user in this case is the viewer. So a quick cover of, remember we had the argument definitions. Now, if we wanted to change in this particular instance on the dashboard, we want to show 10 followers first instead of showing 5 as we have now. We could say arguments. This is how we pass arguments around first, and then we could say that make this 10 instead. Now that we reload here, am I on 3G? Yeah, gotta change that. You can say it loads 10 instead. Maybe 12 is better because it's 2 rows, right? 11 is actually better. Okay, here we go. So when I'm using the followers widget here, the pagination, then I want the first 11 to load. But if we go into the user profile, it's still just the first 6, because that's another query, right? That's another spread of this, and we could make that, if we wanted to, first, say 21 instead. That loads the first 21 ones, but it doesn't affect anything else. It's just like with components. This is just a kind of like a prop that you pass in, and all it says is that if nobody decides differently from the outside, then please use 5 instead. But again, we didn't have to do anything like this before, but we'll stick around with having the viewer actually fetch 11 at first. Okay, I think that should be covering all of it, right? What am I forgetting? Well, theoretically, we could obviously paginate back and forth here, backwards and forwards. I'm not going to do that here because it doesn't make much sense, but still, it's possible. There's also the refetch, which I talked about, which is that you can refetch this entire view and kind of null out any connections yourself, but we're going to cover that in a separate video where we do some proper refetching instead with a real use case. Okay, so I think that's going to be enough for this video. That's a thorough review of, or a thorough kind of discussion about connections and pagination, and I try to show you all of the cool things that Relay does for you. And remember again, like, the modularity of this is at no point did we have to make any change to another part of our application, even though we added a full like connection, a full pagination to this specific component. Really handle all of that for ourselves, and we're still able to configure this on a per use basis if we want to. This is for the number of start, but you could imagine this for being any other type of thing here as well, which we're going to cover more techniques for in later videos. Okay, now that's it. Now that's way I've talked for a long time now. So thank you very much for viewing, and I'll see you soon again.